We're adventurers. You should thank us for being here. The man's arrival had caught all three of them off guard. Croy was kneeling at the hearth, warming his thick dwarven hands at the fire he'd built. Shindara was at the rough log table with her spellbook out, quietly reviewing, memorizing the words to the mass sleep incantation and nibbling on some dried fruit from the cabin's larder. Ulyan, the halfling scout and acquirer, rogue, was such a judgmental word, was poking through a chest of belongings they'd found behind the bed. None of them had seen or heard the big human until they found him filling the doorway, a long knife in his hand, demanding to know what they were doing in his home. It had been Croy who responded, of course. Not only was he the eldest of the three by 2 years, he was the most experienced, having 3 previous adventures under his belt and the brass badge of an apprentice member of the Adventurers Guild to prove it. Shindara, despite her superior elvish education, was on her first foray beyond city walls. Ulyan was also a novice at adventuring, discounting his past experience at liberating food from merchant stalls and the occasional coin from a purse. Seriously, Croy repeated as he let his hand stray near the axe on his belt. You should be grateful. We came all the way out here from Angelport to help save people like you. Save me from what, exactly? The man rumbled. He was big, not much taller than Shindara, but ox-wide and thick-limbed. His arms were nearly as big around as Shindara's waist. Gray-streaked brown hair hung down to his waist and a matching beard did the same. He was clad in rough buckskin and carried a hide bag in one hand, bulging with roots and berries. The sight of him sent a shiver through Shindara that had nothing to do with the late autumn air, and she pulled her sky-blue brocade cloak tight around her while bringing the words of the Arrow of Fire spell to the fore of her mind. Kobolds, Croy replied. They say the hills on this side of the river are full of them. Less full when we get done, right Croy? Ulyan laughed as he nonchalantly closed the chest and slid it back where they'd found it. Aye. Forge God willing, we'll cut their numbers by a few dens worth. The man sighed and sheathed his knife, dropping his bag by the door. I'd offer you the hospitality of my cabin, but I see you've already availed yourselves of it. His tone was not exactly accusing, but it made Shindara redden a little and set aside the fruit. Croy merely grunted affirmatively and took his hand off his axe. Somehow, that made Shindara feel even worse. Sorry for intruding, she muttered. She fished a copper coin out of her purse and held it out, earning scowls from Croy and Ulyan, but the man just shook his head. What would I do with that out here? Buy honey from the bees or pay the creeks for fish? Keep your money. Regardless of circumstance, you're guests under my roof now. He knelt by the table and pulled up a flat stone from the floor, drawing much focused attention from Ulyan. From the hollowed-out space beneath, he drew out a stoneware jug and a clay drinking bowl. I can offer mead, if the bold adventurers have cups to drink it from. They did. Some cheap but stout wooden tankards for Croy and Ulyan, a pewter cup for Shindara. The mead was wild-tasting and thin, but it was better than creek water. The man sat on the fur and moss bed, the jug on the floor beside him, and eyed the trio over the rim of his clay bowl as they all took a few gulps. Croy returned his look with typical dwarvish stoicism while Ulyan paced the room and Shindara huddled nervously in the only chair. The tense silence made her want to fidget, but she controlled herself. There was a straw figure over there, the man said at last, pointing at a low log shelf on the back wall. It was adorned with various odds and ends. Some interesting stones and crystals. A 3-eyed wolf skull. A stick with feathers tied to it. There was a conspicuous gap near the middle of this collection. About so big. A little man made of straw and vines. Tinder, Croy replied with a shrug. We needed something to get the fire going. The man nodded, tight-lipped, and glanced at Ulyan. Also had a good carving knife hanging by the hearth. Ulyan casually turned to put his belt pouch out of view, but again it was Croy, the leader, who answered. Haven't seen it. None of us has. Ah. The silence started getting tense again and Shindara, driven by the urge to break it, pulled a few coppers out of her purse again. "Are you sure you won't take coin? We don't wish to burden you." The man shook his shaggy head. "The only use I might get from coins would be the pleasure of having them. Except silver. I could make arrowheads from that, in case of war-rats, I suppose. But fire works well enough on the likes of them." Shindara started a little. "War-rats? There are lycanthropes in these hills." "Not anymore." He turned to Croy, who was toying with his empty tankard. "More mead, dwarf." "Aye." Croy came over and let the man refill his drink. "And the name's not dwarf. It's Croy. Croy Dunax." He drew himself up to his full 4-foot height and thrust out his chin, though his own red beard was patchy and thin compared to their host's. "The elf breed over there's Shindara Starzinger, and the shifty little fellow is Ulyan." The man inclined his head slightly. "You speak those names as though you mean to make them worth remembering." Croy frowned, trying to figure out if that was an insult or not. "They will be," he blustered. "You can count on that." "And what should we call you, who are so good as to host us?" Shindara felt the need to be diplomatic. She wasn't sure quite how, or why, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Croy's brashness was leading the party into trouble here. The man just shrugged. "Should you have need to call me something, Jack will do. It's a name I'll answer to." Ulyan raised his tankard in toast. "Then here's to you, good Jack. For making your home available for our short repose." He downed his mead in one long gulp and began sorting through the bag Jack had dropped beside the door, picking out the sweeter berries and stuffing them into both mouth and belt pouch. "Just a short repose?" Jack asked, voice too empty of sarcasm to be sincere. "Are you quite sure?" "Aye," grunted Croy. "This is just a stop to rest and top off our provisions. We mean to push on into the hills before making camp. I spied some bluffs higher up where I might dig us a defensible camping cave. Likely enough, we'll find Kobold sign there, too. We've enough food for a 3-day expedition. That's enough time to find some warrens and let these two get their hands wet." He shrugged. "We might stay longer if we can raid the Kobold's larders for rations. They always hide their food caches, but if you can get one alive, a little knife work will find the truth." His lip curled. "Kobolds are gutless little things. Please pray for our success and safe return, good Jack." Shindara offered the human a nervous smile. Jack just took a long, moody pull from his mead bowl, then set it aside. He looked each of the trio in their eyes, then asked, in a heavy voice, "So, what did they do?" Shindara blinked at him. Pardon? What did who do?" Croy's brow furrowed and he frowned in puzzlement. "The Kobolds. What did they do to make you come out to the wilderness to take their lives?" Croy eyed him narrowly. "Does it matter?" Jack shrugged. "To some. Maybe not to others." He stretched and cracked his massive knuckles. "Did they raid some farms across the river? Steal some chickens or such, so the farmers called you in? Back when they lived on that side, kobolds were bad about rustling sheep. They can't do that from here, of course. No boats to haul them on. But I could see them snatching chickens, maybe. Kobolds don't really grasp the idea of a living animal being someone's property. No one called us. This expedition is my own idea. These two show some promise as adventurers." Croy packed a guild grandmaster's worth of pride and condescension into his lowly apprentice rank. But they need an easy first quest to get their feet under them. Kobolds are good for that. And that's all they're good for, Ulyan added with a laugh. "Right, Croy. Right as iron on an anvil. We need to slay some monsters. Kobolds are monsters that need to die. It's that simple." "So, is that what adventuring is, then?" Jack asked. "Killing when you can because you can?" Shindara spoke up, her soft, lilting voice counterpointing the others. It isn't about killing. It's about fighting against evil. And I just asked you what evil the kobolds have done that needs fighting. Shindara smiled. This was firmer conversational ground for her. Her schooling had included a solid foundation of classical elvish philosophy. Evil is not something that is done, it is something that is. Elihaniel's second postulate, good and evil exist as fundamental qualities inherent to the nature of all beings. Thus, a monster must always be a monster, regardless of its actions. She nodded, warming to the subject. It had been a while since she'd conversed on such a level. Croy and Ulyan were fine companions, but not much for discussing intellectual abstractions. The first corollary to Elihaniel's second postulate is, the morality of an act derives entirely from the morality of its actors. Thus, any act by an evil being must be an evil act. And any act by a good being is a good act. Shindara's smile widened. Precisely. Even acts like murder. Jack cut his eyes at Ulyan, who had finished picking goodies out of the bag and had moved on to prying at stones on the floor when he thought Jack wasn't looking. Or theft. Say, rather, killing, Shindara said awkwardly. And appropriating. Those would be the correct terms for such acts by a good being against an evil. She, too, glanced at Ulyan, then back at their host. Or, less good one. Jack arched one shaggy eyebrow. And how is it decided who is good and who is evil, then, if not by their actions? Elihaniel's third postulate, condition follows essence. Meaning that the relative goodness or evilness of any being may be determined by its appearance and mode of living. You have only to compare the graceful forms and sophisticated society of good beings such as ourselves to the brutish primitivity of orcs or kobolds to see the truth of this. Jack stared at her, the eye contact making her nervous again. So, murder and robbery are praiseworthy, provided the victims are less pretty and refined than the perpetrators. Shindara frowned and toyed with the hem of her sky-colored cloak. She looked to her companions, especially Croy, but the dwarf was busy finishing his mug of mead. I would not put it in those words, she said carefully. You didn't. You put it in a great many other words, most of them not your own. The tone of this last was not unkind. Pa! Leave philosophy for the clerics. Croy pounded a fist against his mailed chest. We are adventurers. Men of action. All we need to know is where the monsters are and how to slay them. And it's time we were about it. He stowed away his tankard and shouldered his pack. The trio filed out the door, Jack following silently behind. Shindara felt the weight of his gaze on her and turned to see him standing in front of the cabin door, huge arms folded across his chest. His expression was as stern and unreadable as ever, but his eyes felt just a little sad. Though she, as a half-elf, was almost certainly older than the human, had probably been in school for longer than he had been alive, he suddenly seemed very ancient to her. Ancient and weary. She offered him a polite bow. We thank you for your hospitality, she said. As one who knows these hills, have you any advice to share with us ere we depart? I can advise one thing, but I doubt you'll listen. He sighed. If you go into yon hills seeking kobolds to slay, you may well find them. What you won't find is glory, or honor, or riches. You will not win praise and gratitude for your deeds. Bards will not sing your names nor children play act your adventures. You will win no victories for righteousness. You may do all these things if you return across the river. Fight bandits. Battle the undead. Keep the cities of the graceful lords and ladies safe and bask in their appreciation. But if you go into the hills to slay kobolds, you will die there and be forgotten. This will happen. Shindara shivered at the certainty in his voice and even Ulyan looked uneasy. But Croy merely laughed and shook his head. Die? He demanded. At the hands of kobolds? They can barely use what pitiful weapons they have and have no stomach to stand and fight anyway. And if they do, so what? We have armor and magic and healing potions, and they just have their mangy hides. I've taken their scalps by the sackful before, in the southern desert, and I'll do so again here. He looked the big human up and down, lip curling. You peasants may be right to fear such vermin, but we are adventurers. This is what we do. With that, Croy spun on his heel and stomped away, back stiff and head high. Bolstered by his confidence, Ulyan nodded, grinned, and set off after him. Only Shindara lingered, but faith in her companions and the rightness of their cause firmed her resolve in the face of Jack's words. She nodded to him. Thank you for your concern, good Jack, but despite such risks, evil must be fought. I have faith that good must triumph in the end, and you should, too. And with that, she set off, her longer legs soon catching her up to her companions. Jack watched them file away onto the game trail that led up into the hills. The halfling was leading, scouting, but not too far in front. The armored dwarf in the middle, looking fairly alert. The elf-breed wizard trailing close behind, the dwarf having to remind her to check behind them periodically. Jack watched and noted, until they passed the first turning of the trail and were quite out of sight. He sighed and shook his head. They were warned, he muttered to himself, in the habit of those who keep mostly their own company. Only one thing to do now. He drew the long knife from its sheath on his thigh and tested its edge. Satisfied, he put it back, then stepped inside the cabin. He put a hand up to the rafters and pulled down a heavy hunting bow and a quiver of arrows, mixed broadheads and bodkin points. His guests had raided the choicest bits from his larder, but there was still plenty of dried meat in there. He grabbed a few strips to eat on and then headed off into the woods. His strides were long, but unhurried. The game trail crossed a large creek a couple of miles down and the kobolds had dug out the ford there. It would take the party some time to find another place where a dwarf and a halfling could safely get across. He would catch up to them soon enough. Crooked Tail was picking honeysuckles and keeping one ear cocked toward where her pups were wrestling in the clover when she heard the yipping call of White Patch, the sentry, warning that danger moved in the forest, heading in their direction. White Patch had the best eyes in the warren and was posted in the high fork of an elm, where he could rain spear and stone upon any threats. It was a dangerous task, demanding the highest courage, and was why White Patch was considered the most desirable kobold in the warrens of Flinty Hill. That warning call meant, unknown danger near. Be ready. Quickly, but not panicking, Crooked Tail gathered her 3 pups and began shepherding them toward the nearest entrance to the warren. She made sure her basket of honeysuckles was secure so she wouldn't lose it if they had to run. Those were to flavor a sweet porridge for her sister, Warm Nose. Warm Nose had just birthed her first litter and sweet porridge was a good way to celebrate and to help keep her strength up. Warm Nose had always been so sickly. Crooked Tail had worried that she'd never find a mate because of that, but Bristlepaw had taken to Warm Nose the moment they'd met. And Bristlepaw was a good catch for any she-kobold, even if he did come from a downslope warren. White Patch let out another warning yip, a little higher this time, with a growl on the end. This one meant, unknown danger near. Scent of blood. Now Crooked Tail felt real alarm. Probably White Patch was just picking up a lynx or bobcat that had finished a recent meal. Such creatures were not normally a danger to a grown kobold who was halfway alert, but they had been known to carry off unwatched pups if they got the chance. Or it could be a bear. There were a couple of good-sized black ones who had taken to prowling the valley below Flinty Hill and hadn't yet been taught to avoid kobold spears and torches. But there was always the possibility that it could be those ones the elders spoke of in such fearful tones. The ones who came with long, sharp blades and impenetrable coats, with strange powers that blasted bodies and stole minds. That came from across the river, to kill and kill without ever sating their hunger for kobold flesh. Adventurers, the elders called them. Crooked Tail gathered her pups, who were too young to have real names yet, into her arms, then dipped her head and nipped the smallest and stubbornest by the scruff of his neck. The pup yelped, more from surprise than actual pain, as she straightened up and made the best speed she could with arms and mouth full of young toward the nearest tunnel mouth. There was a crashing in the dry underbrush not far from White Patch's sentry post, and she felt her heart skip with fear. The tunnel was not that far, but her mind was flooded with images of blood-caked, unkillable somethings swarming out of the woods and cutting her down, cutting apart her pups in front of her, breaking into the warren where Warm Nose lay weak and helpless with her little ones. The pups were heavy, and that tunnel seemed so far away. And then she heard a voice. A deep, ringing voice that spoke Kobold with a weirdly smooth accent. "White Patch, if you drop a rock on my head, I'll make you eat it." Relief flooded Crooked Tail and she sagged, letting go of the pups as they started squirming in her grasp. As soon as they were on the ground, they ran toward the sound of that voice, squealing, "Jack! Jack!" From up in the tree, White Patch laughed. "Ha! You scared me so, I almost dropped something stinkier than a rock on your big old head." "You do, and you'll eat that, too." Other kobolds came out of the berry patches and tunnel mouths, ears up and tails wagging. Crooked Tail opened her muzzle in a smile as the big human strode into the clearing, moving carefully to avoid stepping on the pups that swarmed around his boots. His bow was hung on his shoulder and a big pack-sack was in his hand. She added her voice to the others. "Jack! Jack!" A brown and white waist-high blur shot past Crooked Tail and barreled into Jack's leg, latching on like a tick. Spotted Tongue, the youngest she in the warren to actually have a name, barely more than a pup, was beaming up at him from down at his knee. She waved a dolly she'd made from straw and twisted vines up at him. "Jack! I maked you another little human to keep you company. It's a she-human, so the other one will have a mate. You still have him." "I'm sorry, Spotted Tongue," he said, gentle as a father, "but some nasty pests got into my cabin and got him before I could stop them." "Oh. That happens sometimes, with kobolds. Bad things came and took away a mate, or a pup, or a parent. You could only mourn, accept, and go on." Spotted Tongue's expression brightened again. "Is okay. I make you another." She gave his leg a quick squeeze as he took the dolly from her and carefully tucked it into his buckskin shirt. As the young she ran off, Crooked Tail came up and began trying to gather her pups from the mob around those big human feet. "It is always good to see you, friend Jack," she said. "It does me good to see my friends well," he replied in the kobold manner. "How is your sister? She had her pups yesterday. But she has always been so weak and sick. We worry for her. I am making honeysuckle porridge to give her. I can make enough to share with you. Your hospitality honors me. I bring gifts for Warm Nose, to celebrate her first litter." He set his huge pack-sack on the ground and knelt beside it, pulling items from within. "I gathered berries and tubers to keep her larder full while she recovers. And here is a potion which will keep her health up." He set the pouch and the little glass jar on the ground at Crooked Tail's feet. "And this, to wrap her and her pups in comfort while they rest." With a flourish, he pulled forth a mass of cloth, bigger than anything woven in the warrens. It was blue as the midday sky, shiny and soft. "Oh, Jack! How did you come by such a thing? Warm Nose and her pups would rest well in such a treasure." He shrugged and, for just a moment, his smile left his eyes. "I got it from someone who didn't need it anymore." As she took the gift from him, Crooked Tail caught a scent upon his hands, the scent White Patch had picked up earlier. The scent of blood. His hands had been scrubbed with leaves and creek water, but the smell still clung. "Have you been hunting?" "I have." She sniffed again. "I do not recognize the scent of your prey, and you do not carry meat or furs. It was just some pests. Troublesome vermin that will not be missed." "Oh. That is good, then." Some younger kobolds came to help her carry the gifts inside. We will take these gifts to Warm Nose, along with your words of greeting. As always, you have the thanks and welcome of my clan, friend Jack." And as she left Jack there, speaking to the elders and patting and tickling the pups, Crooked Tail couldn't help but reflect that the big human was proof for any kobold to see that truly good people came in all shapes and sizes.